Welcome back to No Longer Enslaved, where we have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. This is episode 2. I'm calling it The War of Frequencies. And before we get started, I need to just kind of lay out some code language I'm going to use because I don't want to receive any dings by YouTube. That thing that started, the outbreak that began in early 2020 that caused shutdowns and millions of people to get sick, I'm going to refer to that as the 19. And then the experimental poke that many corporations and governments are trying to mandate, I'm going to call that the 19 poke. So hopefully that's clear as we progress forward today. But as I mentioned, I want to speak about the war of frequencies because I feel like it's so important that we understand what is happening so that we can be armed with the truth. And in Hosea 4:6, it says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Well, I don't want any of us destroyed. And so I want to speak about, at least from my perspective, what I see as the war of frequencies. And I'm sure that, so many of us, we realize that with each passing day, we're losing more and more of our freedoms. And I think we're living in both the worst of times and the best of times. And I believe we're at a precipice, and it's a precipice of breakthrough. The saying goes that, it's darkest right before the dawn. Well, it might get darker yet, but I believe dawn is coming. So today, I want to inform us of what is this war of frequencies? What does it mean? And so we're going to dive into a couple of concepts. And I've also written an article that you can access on my website, which is nolongerenslaved.com. And it's called War of Frequencies. I'll have a link to it in the description box below. But let's dive in today. So, this war of frequencies, it's unlike any war that we've faced. It's a psychological warfare. And, all of us are under attack. While we may not have bullets flying our way or bombs exploding in front of us, we have all come under attack at some level. And so that's why I feel like it's so important for us to understand this. So what is a war of frequencies? Well, thanks to the growing field of quantum physics, we know that everything, like all matter, has frequency, right? And so every living cell in our body carries a frequency, and that's the vibration of life. Well, not only does matter have frequency, but emotions have frequencies. And it's interesting to think about emotion. Emotion is energy in motion. And so what we have is we generate emotions that can either generate energy or deplete energy. In fact, if we understand that disease is associated with lower frequency emotions or just lower frequency ranges, it can really help us understand how important it is to modulate those negative emotions. So what we have is, these different frequency ranges for emotions. So with the lower frequencies, you might have fear, anxiety, worry, stress, shame. Those types of negative emotions generate lower frequencies. Whereas positive emotions like love, compassion, generosity, empathy, gratitude, those all are higher frequency emotions. So what we find is that when we have this inability to modulate negative emotions, what happens is we develop this state called physiological incoherence. And what that means is our heart beats at an incoherent rate. And what happens then is our bodies can only tolerate this for so long before we start deteriorating our health. So in this war of frequencies, what we're experiencing is both fear-based messaging and shame-based messaging. So let me speak first about the fear-based messaging. As I mentioned, all of humanity is under attack right now. And the attack is happening at that lower frequency range because there's this constant flow of fear-based stories from mainstream media. And the globalists understand that fear is one of the most powerful drivers of mind control. And so they had to create the 19 in order to create fear and panic in the masses. So the 19 was planned. And I know that might be very difficult for some of you to hear. But if you want to understand this further, I encourage you to read the article that I wrote because I do a deeper dive into the evidence that the 19 was planned. And Dr. David Martin, who is an expert in reading patents to discover patent fraud and then also dealing with RICO cases, he has poured over 4,000 19 patents. I was getting a little tripped up in my own code language. So he has a wealth of information. Anyways, I have written that in my article. So, do a deeper dive by reading my article. Again, I'll list it in the description below. But back to the idea now that the 19 was planned. The only method by which the globalists could advance their plan for the domination of humanity was to create a crisis of global proportions. See, they needed to generate fear and panic in the masses so that they could roll out their predetermined goals. And that was, to have these control measures that we would acquiesce to. And unfortunately, so many people have fallen for the trap that was set for us. And, some days I'm just really dumbfounded that so many people have fallen prey to this. But, I'm reminded that when we live in fear, it's difficult for us to access rational thought. You see, fear originates in the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is also known, that part of the brain is known as the primitive brain or the reptilian brain, or another name for it is the hindbrain. So essentially what happens is when we live in fear, our ability to process nuanced information is impaired. And so we're more likely just to blindly follow others without using critical thinking skills. And that's what's happened to us. So many of us, so many have fallen prey to this trap that has been set for us. And so that's why I want to speak to these issues today, because I want to empower us to understand what's going on. Once we can see it for what it is, we can take a step back and we can rise above the attack. And I'm going to be speaking about how we can rise above this attack in just a moment. So, as we think about this fear-based messaging that's happening, this constant flow of mainstream media reports of those that are dying, those that are hospitalized. We have a resurgence of the Delta variant, and, so much is happening. And, we have to go back to these mask mandates or, other mandates put in place. Well, all of that is to generate fear in us so that they can control us. And we have to recognize that fear is one of the lower frequency emotions that can actually weaken our immune system and drive us into disease or sickness. So it's so important we rise above the attack. Now, not only have we been faced with these fear-based messaging tactics, but we've also been bombarded by shame-based messaging. And the shame-based messaging really began that I was able to acknowledge with the masks, the messaging around the mask. First, we were told to wear a mask for the good of the community, or wear a mask for the health of others, or wear a mask to save grandma. But those of us who actually did our own research and discovered that masks do nothing to block the 19. In fact, what they do is they weaken our immune system. So for those of us that chose not to wear masks, we've been called selfish or irresponsible. And so the public shaming ensues. Well, as of the last several months, the shame-based messaging has really been cranked up several notches. And we've been told now by mainstream media and, state health departments and the government, that this has now become a pandemic of the unpoked. And so what happens is there's this, these false reporting or misinformation that's given, whether that's coming from the CDC or mainstream media, or again, by our state health departments. And what it's telling us is false. And so many people that, have received the 19 poke and received, both their doses of it, they believe that the 19 is now being spread by the unpoked. Again, this simply is not true. And we only need to look at the recent outbreak in Massachusetts. And actually, the CDC actually came out and reported this particular event accurately. And what they found is that 74% of those infected with the 19 in this more recent outbreak were actually fully poked. Now, that's interesting because what that shows us is this is not a pandemic of the unpoked. But unfortunately, so many of those that have been fully poked believe the lie. And so they are engaging in shame-based messaging and telling the unpoked that they're murderers. I mean, some of the stuff on social media is just so vile because they've bought into the agenda and this war of frequencies. And so because they've been overwhelmed by fear, worry, anxiety, anger, they allow shaming to come out of their mouth. And you see, the globalists, they know what they're doing. They know that if they attack us at this lower frequency range, what happens is that they can disconnect us and they can divide us because they know that together we are strong, but divided we are weak. And so this is what is busy happening to us right now. And it's so important that we can see it and call it out and not give in to this shame-based messaging. In fact, it's just another form of the Hegelian dialectic that I've talked about, in other podcasts. And if you're interested in understanding more about the Hegelian dialectic, I've written articles on that as well. And if you go to my website, nolongerenslaved.com, the article entitled No Longer Enslaved by Fear, I have charts that spell out what the Hegelian dialectic is and how it's been affecting us in 2020 and 2021. So once we understand that this is a war of frequencies, we can rise above the attack. And that's what's so encouraging because we are never without hope. So many of us are waking up and seeing what's going on. And the more that, the globalists try and infringe upon our freedoms, the more the masses are beginning to stand up. And it's so encouraging to see. So don't back down, hold the line. And I want to speak about how we can rise above the attack. We may not be able to control circumstances around us, whether those are mandates or lockdowns or, difficult things that happen to us. But what we can control is our response to these circumstances. You see, the globalists, what they want us to do is they want us to fall into their trap. Now, once again, the Hegelian dialectic, it consists of problem, reaction, and solution. And so the problem that was created by the globalists was the release of the 19. And that creates a reaction in the masses of fear and panic so that we acquiesce and we give in. We look to our governing bodies for a solution. And of course, the governing bodies have a predetermined solution already selected. And in 2020, that was the suspension of our liberties. And in 2021, it's the poke mandate. So what we do is we recognize this is what's going on, and we don't allow ourselves to respond with fear, anxiety, anger, worry, and shame, because that's giving them exactly what they want. That's keeping us at those lower frequency emotions. But instead, what we do is we respond with positive emotions. We respond with courage and strength, with love, with gratitude and empathy and generosity, because those things will keep us above the frequency where the battle is raging. Now, there's this vicious cycle that's playing out right now. So here we have the 19 was released on purpose. And again, go to my article that I just posted called The War Frequencies. And I do a deep dive into why I'm saying that. But so the 19 was released. And then we had the mitigation strategies, which actually weakened our immune system. And then we have the release of the poke, which there's a whole host of issues with that, that are harmful to our bodies. And then on top of that is the war of frequencies. And so if the globalists didn't get us with the 19, and they didn't get us with the mitigation strategies, and they didn't get us with the poke, they're hoping that they can attack our health through the war of frequencies. But again, we are never without hope. And it's so fascinating because, understanding epigenetics, we can change our thoughts, our behaviors, and our lifestyle choices. And that can actually have a positive impact on our health. And if we understand the power of epigenetics, epi means a set of instruction, or epi means on top of. So epigenetics is a set of instructions that sits on top of our gene, our genome. And there's such a thing called epigenetic markers, which is like a light switch that can be turned on or off. And so what we want to do is we want to turn on those epigenetic markers that will actually improve our health. And so how we do that is we recognize the power that is generated by our heart. So the HeartMath Institute has done some incredible research in this topic, and I want to share a few things with you along these lines. So I'll read to you a quote from one of the researchers involved with the HeartMath Institute. They found that the heart is uniquely positioned as a powerful point of entry into the communication network that connects the body, mind, emotions, and spirit. And what's fascinating is, so the electrical activity that's generated by our heart is 60 times stronger or greater than what's generated by our brain. And then the magnetic field that's produced by our heart is more than 100 times stronger than that which is produced by our brain. So what does this mean? Now, there's another neuroscientist named Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he's done a ton of research in this area. And what he's found is that when you combine a clear intention, so you have what's called brain coherence, because you're focusing, you have clear intention on generating elevated emotions, which that is called heart coherence. What that does is that produces energy that can bring forth health. Now remember, I spoke about how emotions can either generate energy or deplete energy. So those emotions that are on the higher end of the frequency range, they generate energy. But those on the lower frequency range, they deplete energy from the reserves within our body. And so we can only go so long, like I mentioned earlier. When we have depleted energy, or we have this physiological incoherence, what happens is we have this depleted state, and that's where disease comes from. And our bodies can only tolerate that for so long. So here we have the opportunity to intentionally generate positive emotions. And when we do that, it creates this energy that can actually bring healing to our body. And so when we generate these heartfelt emotions like love and joy and empathy, compassion, generosity, and gratitude, it allows our heart to beat more coherently. And what happens with this is actually really exciting, because again, when we have that clear intention of generating these positive emotions, it activates this internal experience, and it can foster these incredible spiritual experiences for us. And I like to liken it to a term that I heard Graham Cook use. It was actually a prophetic word that he gave towards the beginning of this year, and it's called unrestricted latitude. I love that term. In fact, that's my word of the year, where I am focused on that phrase and just asking the Lord to help me enter into unrestricted latitude. But anyways, so when we have these experiences where, we're quiet, we come into more of a meditative, prayerful state. And I call it a time of silence, where I just come before the Lord in silence, and I just want to be in his presence. I'm not coming before him with all these requests, these prayer requests. I'm just simply coming before him to be still and to focus on his character and who he is. And in those times, what happens is he envelops me, and I come into his presence, and there's this unrestricted latitude where, he blows my mind with the experiences that I have. And what happens when we have those types of internal experiences is that it can actually rewire our brain. And the beauty of how we're created is that, when we have these positive internal experiences, it carries that higher frequency that rewires our brain, and it can override past traumatic or painful experiences. And that's why, those of us that have a spiritual relationship and have fostered that, we know that in the presence of God, it cleanses our past. Those things in our past that are negative, that keep us bound up and captive, those can be washed clean. And part of it is coming into his presence in that stillness and silence, and being intentional and tapping into those positive emotions, allowing his love just to envelop us. And what happens is we literally are generating energy. And it's fascinating. I won't go into too much more about the research, but they actually do EEGs, and they look at EEGs and ECGs. So they look at the brain waves and the heart patterns, the heartbeat patterns. And when we get into those internal experiences where we're in the presence of God, it generates coherence and energy, and that energy brings forth healing. So, for me, no matter what takes place around us, we have the opportunity to flourish, because we can generate these positive internal experiences. And really, for me, it starts with gratitude. No matter, what pit I've dug myself into because of this accumulation of negative emotions, the way of escape is through a heart of gratitude. And I just want to share with you briefly an experience, probably about, almost 13 years ago. Our youngest son had tremendous health issues, and it really rocked my world. It was a very traumatic experience, and it took me about 2 years to pull out of that trauma. And there was a time where I was really down, and I felt like I was on the precipice of just having a mental break and never coming back from it. And that's scary. I'm a psychologist. I've seen that happen in people. I knew what I was facing. I was right there, like in this massive pit. And I'll never forget, because I was driving my older son to school one day, and I'm just internally focused on all the negative things. And the Holy Spirit spoke to me and said, "Would you just be thankful?" And it stopped me in my tracks. And I realized, I don't even know where to start in being thankful. Everywhere I look around me in my life and my circumstances are negative. But I was driving a car, and so I just began to be thankful for the car I was driving. and that I had gas in my car, and that the roads I were driving on were paved. And, it just started with those simple things. And the more I developed that muscle of gratitude, like that practice of gratitude, the more I allowed my heart to beat with a heartfelt gratitude, it pulled me out of those negative emotions. And for me, that was the start of my turnaround. And so I want to encourage you with that today. No matter what circumstances you're facing, we can be thankful for something. And I want to share with you, just to close, I had a really encouraging email from a subscriber, and they reached out to me and asked me to pray because their wife was faced with the circumstance of, you either get the 19 poke or you're fired. And she was a nurse working in a fertility clinic, and that was her passion. And so it was a very difficult situation. And, she didn't want to get the 19 poke for her own health, because she was aware of some of the issues. But she also did not want to lose her job, and she was concerned about, the financial impact of that. And her husband that reached out to me, he felt very strongly that she was not to get the 19 poke, but, they had to come together and decide. And so anyways, they reached out to me, and I responded by, sending some encouragement and let them know I was praying for them, and just to encourage them that Jesus is the way maker, and, to come together as a couple and seek the Lord for direction. And if the Lord tells her to get the poke, it's an adventure in trusting in Him for her protection. If the Lord says, don't get the poke, it's an adventure in trusting the Lord in provision. So anyways, several weeks had transpired, and he responded back to me and gave me an update. And it's so encouraging. So she had decided she did not want to get the poke. And she had a nursing colleague reach out to her and say, hey, did you hear that Dr. So-and-so was looking for a nurse? Well, that last name was very familiar to her. So she came to her husband and said, do you know somebody with this last name? And it turns out it was one of the husband's best friends. Like, the doctor was the wife of the husband's closest friend. And so the husband reached out, and within a matter of days, his wife had an interview with this doctor, and the doctor has not gotten the 19 poke herself. The doctor prescribes ivermectin, and the doctor would never force any of her employees to get the poke. And so what ended up happening is, his wife was able to get employed by this doctor who happens to be a believer as well. And so it's such an incredible story of how Jesus provides the way, even when there seems like there's no way. So I want to end just by encouraging us all with that, and to recognize that we are in the midst of this war of frequencies, but we do not have to be dragged down to the lower frequency range where the battle is raging. Rise above the attack and intentionally foster those positive emotional experiences that will generate the energy within us to bring health and healing and restoration. And then take those times where you're quiet before the Lord. And maybe you don't have a relationship with Jesus, but you just want to have a quiet meditative experience. Focus on the things that you're thankful for, and allow love just to expand within you. I often think about that passage, and let me just grab it really quick. It's in 1 John 4:18, and it says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. So let's draw near to the one who has perfect love, and that is Jesus, because love overcomes fear.